haunting tales of Dark Shivering. Dark Shivering is a village lost on the border of England and Wales. Hidden between two countries, claimed by neither, and heeded by both. I've collected old stories passed down through generations which have been considered fairy stories. But when the wind groans, and the trees creak, and the man in your closet stares at you, you know there are no fairy tales here. The Wendigo. Wendigo's heritage is from the First Nations in America. Not England or Wales you'd think. But what else could you call a deer-headed man stalking the area? The first known sighting in Dark Shivering of this creature was in 1986 by a group of boys who were taking a shortcut home from school through the woods. It was late November, and by the time they'd entered the woods at gone 3:30 it was already beginning to get dark. They walked along their usual route that after years of many children pounding the woodland floor had created their own path through the oak trees. The boys were telling jokes and pushing each other around when they came to an immediate stop as they all heard a noise from above. It sounded like a crow cawing, and lots of movement in the branches. Just as they were looking at each other shrugging off the noise, a huge form dropped from the trees and landed next to them. In the ruckus that ensued, the boys had such a shock that they were running into each other and screaming whilst the form in front of them grew in size. Some of the boys ran off without ever seeing properly what they were running from, but 3 of the boys had been frozen in fear and stood staring at this figure that was slowly rising from its landing position. Each time it stretched itself more into a standing position, the boys could hear cracking-type noises as if its bones were breaking at every move. Within seconds it had risen to its full height, and all 3 boys said it was over 8 feet tall. In their terror, they thought it was a man wearing the mask of a stag. But as they took a last look before running off, they could see it breathing through its nostrils and opening its mouth. As its mouth was open, all 3 boys heard the voice of their schoolteacher, and they were unmistakably told to run. The boys' story was dismissed as nothing but schoolboy pranks, and the incident was all but forgotten in the following weeks until Christine Jones, who lived in a bungalow at the edge of the woods, heard a noise outside her patio doors one night. She pulled the curtains open and stared out into the darkness. She could see nothing and so closed the curtains to return to her knitting. Just as she was about to sit down, she was sure she heard a noise outside again. It was probably a cat or something, she thought. But thinking it best to check, she grabbed the curtains and pulled them apart. There, standing behind her curtains, was a Wendigo. It was tall with a man's torso, but the head was that of a stag. Its antlers were majestic, but its eyes were stone cold dead. Christine's heart sped up as the horror took a hold. The Wendigo opened its mouth, and she clearly heard the voice of her dead mother tell her not to go off with strange men, a common phrase of her mother's when she was a small child. Christine fainted and only awoke hours later to a fractured skull from the fall. The bungalow by the woods was soon up for sale. Probably the most terrifying encounter with the Wendigo happened the following year in 1987. 2 men, Dave Jones and Tony Brown, were out until late one evening fishing in the local pond. They had been sat there all afternoon and evening, and they were just starting to lose light. Neither had caught any fish all day, and so when Tony suddenly got a bite on his line as they were packing away, both men became excited at the prospect of at least one catch of the day. Tony began to slowly and carefully reel it in. It felt as though it could be a large fish as the pull on the line was strong. As the line got shorter and shorter, Tony began to see movement under the water. He pulled it to the water's edge where Dave had a net waiting to scoop up the fish. Tony quickly realized it wasn't a fish that he'd caught, but some kind of wood or something entangled in his line. He reached in the water to sort out the tangled mess and grabbed at what he thought was a branch. He pulled it hard out of the water and turned to Dave to get the net ready. Dave laughed and told Tony he'd caught an old deer skull instead of a fish. As they both laughed and pulled on the skull, suddenly it gave way and came out of the water with great ease. Both men fell backwards and found themselves looking up at the Wendigo. Dripping with water and algae caught on its antlers, the deer raised its head to the sky and let out an angry growl, warning the two men of its displeasure. The body was of a toned man. It lowered its head to look at the scared men, but they were no longer there. They'd left all their fishing tackle and run off into the night. The final sighting in the area that was reported in the 80s was by a teenage boy who had been left alone to babysit his sister whilst his parents were out for the evening. He had invited a friend over to watch films with him as his sister was only 5 years old and so was in bed by 8 p.m. After they had watched the film, the friend left his house to walk home at about 10:30 p.m. He closed the door and walked back into the lounge when he heard a knock at the door. He thought his friend had forgotten something and so went back to the door and opened it. His friend was nowhere to be seen. Outside his gate, however, stood the Wendigo. The boy was terrified and slammed the door. He locked it and put the chain and bolt across. Unsure of what to do next, he heard more knocking. He decided to look through the spy hole quickly, but wished he hadn't. The Wendigo was now stood on his porch step. He started panicking and then heard the door rattle as if the creature was trying to come in. Thank goodness he'd bolted the door. Unfortunately, this had no stopping effect on the Wendigo as he watched the bolt slowly moving back to its open position. The boy was quick thinking and moving. He ran upstairs to grab his sister from her bed. He told her to hold onto his back as he heard the chain on the front door being ripped from its frame. Luckily for him, he'd climbed down the drainpipe to sneak out many times before and so was able to maneuver himself and his sister down to the ground. He ran to his neighbor's house, but as he was about to bang on the door, his parents pulled up into the driveway. After finding their front door badly damaged, his parents knew something had happened that night, but they weren't prepared to believe it was a deer-headed man. They assumed a burglar had tried his luck on their house whilst they were out. Ultimately, they were just glad their children were safe. I've heard no more stories about the Wendigo since these few occurrences back in the 80s. The Parlor. Whilst sat one cold winter's night by the fire in the dark Shivering Inn, I was looking through some work papers and making notes for the following day when an old gentleman came and sat with me by the fire. There was only the two of us in the lounge area, and that wasn't unusual for this time of year. The only couple of staff who were there were in the kitchen, and you could hear them chattering and laughing and generally making the most of the quiet season. I finished what I was writing and made polite conversation with the old chap sat opposite me. As it turned out, he was a very talkative character, and I ended up going off to bed that night far later than I should have done, as the following day I had a hectic schedule. The man's name was Dennis, and after telling him that I was collecting unusual stories about dark Shivering, he soon filled the next few hours with non-stop stories of old. The one I found most intriguing was about the devil visiting a house deep in Marvel Bank Woods that occurred in the 1800s. It was so interesting, and he told it in so much detail that when I wrote this book I had to find Dennis again and record his story word for word on my recorder. As is usually the way, the best version of a story comes from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And here it is. It was the late 1800s. Queen Victoria was on the throne, and people far and wide across the land were experimenting with seances and the like. The Queen was even said to be practicing in this area, as she wanted desperately to contact her beloved husband, and as was the case in those days, whatever the monarch was doing would trickle down to the masses and become the latest fashion in high society. The Ingalls family, who used to live in the only house on Marvel Bank, which is now just an empty ruin, were not high society or even interested in contacting the dead, but one fateful weekend they had a visitor who was. Now, Mr. Ingalls used to work one of the mines on Marvel Bank, and Mrs. Ingalls used to take in other people's laundry and so forth to keep their heads and the heads of their 5 children above water. They were lucky enough that their house was rather large, and being out in the middle of the woods, they had added various extensions on here and there, and so in the end the house probably doubled in size. One of the ladies in the village who was lucky enough to get Mrs. Ingalls to do her laundry was Mrs. Partridge, She had money from old, and even though she had maids and cleaners, she insisted that Mrs. Ingalls do her laundry, as no one else could do laundry quite like her. Usually when Mrs. Partridge wanted her laundry done, one of her maids would go back and forth to Marvel Bank, but on this one occasion Mrs. Ingalls was surprised to see Mrs. Partridge walking up the garden path. The two ladies greeted each other, and Mrs. Partridge gave Mrs. Ingalls a modest bag of laundry and then went on to inquire if Mrs. Ingalls would be interested in putting a guest up for the forthcoming weekend, as she knew they had room and kept an immaculate house. She said she would pay the Ingalls handsomely for the privilege, and that her guest would need a room from the Friday evening, leaving on the Monday morning. The guest would be out for most of the daytime. The main requirement was a bed each night. Mrs. Ingalls was pleased that Mrs. Partridge should think so highly of her to ask such a favor, and agreed to have the stranger stay. The money would come in very useful, and the children could easily give up one of their bedrooms and share for the weekend. As was the norm for Mrs. Ingalls, she cleaned the house from top to bottom until even the flagstone floor was shining ready for her guest. At about 8 o'clock on the Friday evening, Mrs. Partridge came walking up to Marvel Bank with her guest in tow. He was a well-dressed man who looked to be in his 30s. He wore a black suit, his hair was long and dark, tied back into a neat ponytail. Mrs. Partridge introduced the gentleman as Mr. Gregory Rasputin. The two eldest Ingalls children were immediately taken with him, offering to take his bag, showing him his room, and chattering away as children do, and Mr. Rasputin seemed very mild-mannered, calm, and to be enjoying the children's obvious interest in him. Mrs. Partridge did not stay long, only to say that her maid would come and meet her guest the next day, and following that he retired to his room almost straight away. The following day Mrs. Ingalls awoke to find Mr. Rasputin already up. He was sat in the garden smoking a pipe whilst the children were playing around him and asking him questions and telling him stories of their own. He looked to have a hypnotic effect on the children, and they all seemed drawn to him. She called out to him to see that the children were not bothering him, and he warmly smiled, shaking his head that he was fine. Mid-morning Mrs. Partridge's maid arrived and walked happily away with Mr. Rasputin. Mrs. Ingalls was happy for him to come and go as he pleased without asking any questions. She had enough on her plate and quickly set her children to work doing chores to help around the house. Later in the day Mr. Rasputin returned to Marvel Bank alone and asked Mrs. Ingalls if she would mind him entertaining a guest. He would be no trouble and would keep to his own room for the evening. Well, Mrs. Ingalls could do better than this for her charming guest. She was taking the whole family across the village to visit her sister, who had been poorly. She intended on doing chores around her sister's house, which she had been too ill to manage herself. She expected to be back very late as there was lots to do. She told Mr. Rasputin to make himself and his guest at home and to not worry about keeping to his room. He could use any room he felt most comfortable in. At about 10 p.m. on that Saturday evening, the Ingalls family returned home to find the house in darkness. They assumed Mr. Rasputin had retired to his room, and that his guest had left earlier in the evening. On the Sunday morning that followed, Mr. Rasputin was nowhere to be seen. Assuming him still to be in his room, Mrs. Ingalls went about her day as normal. The children played outside in the woods as Mr. Ingalls was chopping blocks of wood for most of the day. Mrs. Ingalls was busying herself in the kitchen. It wasn't long into the day before Mrs. Ingalls began hearing a knocking sound coming from her parlor. She hadn't been into the parlor room that day and had intended on cleaning it later. It was only used on special occasions and some Sundays, and so a flash of regret washed over her when she remembered offering any of her rooms to Mr. Rasputin. She hoped he had left it tidy and had not smoked his pipe in there. She didn't want that lingering smell in her furnishings. She popped her head around the door to check its condition and found to her delight it looked and smelled as she had left it. She forgot about the knocking and continued with her day. It was fast approaching 5 p.m. Mrs. Ingalls still had heard no stirring from Mr. Rasputin's room, and so decided she could wait no longer to remake his bed and freshen his room. She knocked on the bedroom door, but received no reply, and so she entered. The room was tidy. The bed had been stripped and Mr. Rasputin's belongings had all gone. Maybe he had left very early in the morning, maybe late the night before. She was slightly disappointed that he hadn't said goodbye or left a note, but decided that some people's nature was just not like that. And anyway, she was sure Mrs. Partridge would let her know why he left earlier than planned. She took no offense and remade the bed ready for her children to return to that night. After she had finished there, she started polishing in the parlor. Once in there, she realized that Mr. Rasputin must have used this room the night before, as her table had been pulled away from the wall and 3 chairs were drawn up to it. It was no bother. She pushed it back into place and began polishing it vigorously. As she did so, she began to hear the knocking once again and quickly realized it was coming from the table she was cleaning. She checked it all over, but there didn't seem to be a reason for the knocks, and she was becoming more than a little nervous about it. She quickly finished what she was doing and left the room. As she did so, she distinctly heard the table she had just been polishing drag itself across the floor. Without turning to look, Mrs. Ingalls shut the door, drew a cross against herself, and said a silent prayer upwards for peace to return to her home. Mr. Ingalls was just coming to the end of his wood pile when he saw his wife walking hurriedly down the path. He called out to her, but she continued on without so much as a wave or nod. That was a woman on a mission, probably heading over to her sister's house, he thought to himself. Mrs. Ingalls knocked on the large ornate door of the Partridge residence. The door was quickly opened, and before she could speak, the maid pulled her inside and told her that they had been expecting her and she was to go straight up to Mrs. Partridge's bedroom, where the old lady was waiting to see her. When she entered the bedroom, the curtains were half drawn and the room was dim. She turned to see Mrs. Partridge in her bed. She did not look well, and her bed was disheveled as though she had tossed and turned relentlessly. "Who was that man you sent to me?" said Mrs. Ingalls unfalteringly cold. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Ingalls. I implore you to believe I had no idea what this man could do," said Mrs. Partridge. My dear, if only I had known, I would never have put upon you and your family. I would never have entertained the man myself." "Tell me what happened," said Rosemary Ingalls. "I invited him here to contact the dead. I'm such a fool. I wanted so desperately to contact my husband. I should have known nothing good could come of it. Arthur, my husband would never have approved of such things, but I have been so lonely without him." As she finished her sentence, she pulled herself together some more and began to tell Mrs. Ingalls what had occurred. "His name is indeed Gregory Rasputin. He is a well-known mystic and conjurer of the departed. I had it on good authority that I would be most satisfied with his service, and so I wrote to him, and invited him to stay. He responded almost immediately, but requested that he stay somewhere close to nature or with a large garden where he could be at one with the natural earth. I thought of you immediately, Mrs. Ingalls, but not to cause you any harm, I assure you." "Go on," said Rosemary. "Well, I cannot and will not speak of yesterday's events, but let it be known that I have seen things I never thought possible. I know things that are not meant for the human mind. I have been told secrets I can never reveal. For the love of God, after he and an accomplice left my house yesterday, I sent the maid straight to your house to warn you to revoke your invitation to him, but you were not there. The house was in darkness," the maid said. "Apart from one room where the curtains were partially drawn, she took a look through the gap and came away screaming. Inside the room were Mr. Rasputin, his accomplice, and a third." Mrs. Ingalls was starting to feel worried now. She had a horrible feeling in the pit of her stomach that she knew who this third visitor was going to be. Mrs. Partridge gathered herself and continued, "My maid, Helen, is a truthful girl. Whatever she tells me I believe. Even this, which sounds totally unbelievable. She said that the 2 men were entertaining the devil himself. He was sat at the table, but he was so large his head and shoulders were at least 2 feet higher than the other guests. She saw his cloven feet. She smelled the sulphurous air. And she looked into his soulless eyes. His eyes quickly darted and locked in on her, looking through the window. He creepily smiled, and that is when she ran." Rosemary Ingalls did not say another word to Mrs. Partridge. She calmly walked out of her house and back home to where the devil himself had been but just the night before. On her way back home, she called into the vicarage, and no sooner had she entered than she was leaving again with the local vicar in tow. They both walked to Marvel Bank purposefully and with one aim in mind: to cleanse the house of all evil spirits and demons. When they arrived, Mr. Ingalls was still outside with the children, and Mrs. Ingalls told him in no uncertain terms to stay there and keep the children there too. Inside the house all was still and quiet. The vicar went into each room, meticulously covering every inch with prayers, incense and holy water. The last room was the parlor, and as they both entered, the vicar and Mrs. Ingalls were overcome by a sulphurous smell that burned their nostrils. They were not to be deviated from their work, however, and the vicar went into spiritual battle against the unholy visitors in the room. It was a sight that had to be seen to be believed. The room was filled with wailing and screams. The vicar and Mrs. Ingalls were pelted by human excrement. The walls were splashed with urine and the floor was bathed in blood. The fight continued for over an hour until suddenly, the room fell into silence. In a flash, the window flew open and the toxic atmosphere was sucked out of the room. As they stared in wonder and disbelief at what had just happened, both the vicar and Mrs. Ingalls saw a dark form jump from next to the table and speed out of the window into the forest outside. At last the devil had gone, but not without leaving his mark. Next to the table where the dark form had stood was 2 cloven hoof marks burned into the floorboards for all time as a reminder of his visit. Mrs. Ingalls and her family continued to live in her beloved house that she took such great care of, but the house was never to be the same again. Although the devil had been banished from her home, he had left some minions behind to sour the air. It was only on the long, lonely winter nights that the table in the parlor would begin knocking, but the family could not rid themselves of the noises. They removed the table, but still the knocking could be heard from the room, so they put it back and locked the parlor for good. Eventually, after the children had grown up and moved out, Mrs. Ingalls was left a widow. She lived there until the day she died, the house decaying around her. Her children implored her to go and live with one of them, but she wanted to be in her own home. When she died, no one would go near the old place, and soon it fell into the ruin that stands there today. Locals were weary of the house that the devil had visited, and so people kept their distance. The story of the devil visiting Marvel Bank didn't end in the 1800s, however. In the 1930s, a developer had taken a fancy to the ruined property and its land and decided he wanted to rebuild a house there on the old Ingalls house foundations. It wasn't to be, though, as he could get no one to work there after workmen reported seeing a large demon-shaped monster stood amongst the trees watching them like they were his prey. Nothing came of the venture, and the site was left for nature to take over. And the reason Dennis knew the story so well: his surname is Ingalls and he was the youngest child of Rosemary Ingalls. The Ritual. Wisteria Lodge started life in the early 1700s. Over the years, the house has been slowly added on to with extensions from various eras, so that by the 1990s it became the sprawling lodge that we see today. Generations of the Armstrong family have lived there for over 200 years, and in this time they have set out one of the most beautiful and well-established country gardens I have ever seen. The gardens are open to the public for most of the year, as each season has its own showcase which is equally amazing in color and life as the next. Even in the midst of winter, the garden is alive with hues and tones. People flock from all over to see these gardens, and it is one of my favorite places to visit when I'm in dark Shivering. The lodge itself sits behind Devil's Church graveyard, and its gardens stretch out in front of it, welcoming guests with perfumes and scents floating in the air. To all intents and purposes, it looks like the idyllic setting we would all love to live in. That is, however, until you dig a little deeper. One of the most intriguing family members to live there was Alexander Armstrong. He followed a nonconformist way of life from 1875 until 1947. His life, in fact, started with an unusual event when his mother, who was a very religious and highly strung woman, seemed to suffer from a delusional period after Alexander was born. She would tell anyone that would listen that he was the devil's child and that he kept giving her the evil eye. This went on and off for the rest of her life until she died from consuming rat poison in 1890. How she came to eat it or why was never discovered, and due to her already fragile state of mind, people were quick to assume she had taken her own life. By this time, Alexander was a young man. He spurned most orthodox religion and had chosen to follow an altogether more controversial lifestyle in its day. He ranked highly in the Masons and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a magical order concerned with spiritual development, and in turn used these influences to guide his life through a long trail of recreational drug taking, sexual depravity of all kinds, and gaining supernatural knowledge. He flounced from one experience to the next, living off his family and drunk on life. It was early in the 1900s that his thirst for learning pushed him to the edge of each encounter, and compelled him in his magical studies. His family put up with his eccentric ways and left him to his own devices. His father and two sisters still lived with him at Wisteria Lodge, and all were loath to accept his devilish ways. The current Armstrong generation that occupies the lodge has a large collection of diaries written by previous family members. Both Alexander's sisters were keen diarists, and theirs especially are filled with secrets and tales of shocking behavior that they could only share with their diaries at that time. Many entries describe Alexander's attempt at performing dark rituals and grimoires, that once performed will open the door for your holy guardian angel to come in and enlighten you with untold knowledge and leave you with the power to direct a legion of demons in your bidding for wealth and power. Diary extracts from Helen Armstrong.
The 10th of September 1905. This fool of a man will be the end of our family. Yes, he is my brother, but in no way are we similar. I pray every day to save his soul from the devil, but I fear it is too late. He has gone further than most men would dare in his quest. His quest which I do not understand. To me his quest for knowledge and power is his attempt at playing God, no less. Both Elizabeth and I live in a state of perpetual fear. The fool has been messing with nature. He sits daily in a darkened room with no food, and only minimal amounts of water. Praying he says, but I know of no prayers spoken in those covert tones. The 15th of November 1905. It has been 2 months since my brother began this obscene work of his. Elizabeth and I were in the garden late afternoon when, bold as you like, Alexander came strolling out as if he had never been holed up in a room these previous weeks. Neither of us spoke as his usual dirge filled the air. I smiled to myself secretly. The moronic fool can't even devote himself to his God. What chance does he have with mine? The 27th of November 1905. These past few nights have been simply intolerable. Elizabeth and I have taken to sharing a bed through sheer terror. We have been hounded by a giant beast that walks the corridors at night. It bangs on the walls, runs up the staircase and howls along the upper floors. Father said he has heard no such thing, but I know he feels the evil all around us. The foolish boy has wandered off for his next adventure and left us to cope at the demon's lair. I have spoken to the minister who will visit us sometime tomorrow. We are to sit and pray whilst in battle with this awful beast. Never have I felt the need for God's grace as strongly as I do now, and I can only hope that he does not forsake me as I have given his enemy a home. The 23rd of December 1907. Whilst taking some quiet time today to consider and read my Bible, a nasty little monster came and tried to distract me from my work. He was a small one this time, less than a foot in height, and he began hanging off my book, swinging back and forth trying to steal my concentration away. After ignoring him for a while I decided enough was enough and I flicked him on his head to get rid of him. Poof! Off he went in a cloud of black smoke. Strange how I have become accustomed to dealing with my brother's evil house guests. I continue to pray each day that they will leave me in peace, but for now anyway. I am stronger than them, as I can dance in the light, not just the dark.
It would seem from these diary extracts that Alexander never finished the occultic ritual that he'd started, which is said to be a dangerous position to be in. By not finishing what he had started, he left the door open for any elemental spirit to visit, not just his holy guardian angel. and by all accounts they did visit over the years. The family still reports strange sightings and occurrences, including incidents of the howling noises from the upper floors late at night, and no one uses Alexander's chambers. A later diary entry by his great-niece suggests that the rooms were not fit for purpose as the air in them is still rancid. She doesn't make clear if this is an actual smell permeating the air in the rooms, or if it's her general discomfort with its history. I am hoping that one day the diaries of the Armstrong family will be published. They are a fascinating insight to a bygone era that brings Wisteria Lodge and its residents to life. They answer a lot of questions as to why the gardens have been designed in a certain way, and why the house was built and decorated to certain criteria. I have only had a brief glimpse at some of the diaries, as the family allow them to be displayed to the public via the British Heritage Society, who have deemed them of great importance to our cultural understanding. It would be fitting to end this story with a tale of how Alexander Armstrong was also haunting Wisteria Lodge and had been seen on many occasions recreating the rituals in his ghostly form. However, this isn't what happened at all. Alexander Armstrong had been living in Wisteria Lodge at the time of his death in 1947, but his ghost has been reported elsewhere. His is the ghost that causes a nasty stink down at the Masons' Lodge in Little Dilly, which is the neighboring town to dark Shivering. The Masons know when he is in the building as a bad odor fills the air. He is also known to push people and has been seen on many occasions stood in the dark shadows waiting for meetings to begin. The Witch Dolls. The Moody Cow stands at a central crossroads in dark Shivering. It has been there for over 200 years and is full of original features throughout. It boasts low ceilings with beams, wooden floors and flagstones. When it began life as a tavern, it was originally called the Traveller's Rest, and being on a main route through the village, it was indeed somewhere for travelers to rest. It used to offer room accommodation, but now enjoys the popularity of its 5-star restaurant instead. I have eaten there on many occasions and found it to be nothing less than delicious. The chap who owns the Moody Cow enjoys a good chat at the end of service with his customers, and it was on one of these occasions that he sat with me and my guests and told us all about the recent strange events at his establishment. This is his story in his own words.
When I bought the Moody Cow in 1999, I was really happy that I had managed to buy an already thriving business. At first we continued running it with accommodation, but it was always my intention to turn the upstairs into private living quarters and to concentrate on achieving my first Michelin star. Within the first couple of years we really put all our energies into transforming the place into what we had always envisioned. By 2002 we had stopped all accommodation and had moved into the upstairs living area ourselves. The work inside the building was complete, and in 2004 I achieved my first Michelin star after a lot of hard work. In this time, I began to feel that the outside of building was letting the business down and there was nowhere outside that people could sit or eat if they wanted, so my next project was to create a garden area for the customers to enjoy. I wanted the job done properly and so employed a landscape gardener to transform the outside area into a flower-filled garden. I was surprised at how fast the garden took shape, and within weeks the gardener had finished, and on his last day he popped into my office with a box full of things and told me that he had dug some items up in the garden and that I might like to look through them before throwing anything out. He left them inside my office door and I thought no more about it. In the following weeks my wife started to have nightmares about being attacked by an old witch-type woman. She said that the witch kept screaming at her, "Poppets, poppets, where have you put my poppets?" Well, neither of us knew what it meant, and I wasn't particularly worried until my wife said that she had started to see this old woman in the daytime when she was fully awake. To be honest, it gave me the creeps a little. But I was steaming ahead with the business and everything was so busy and exhausting that I just didn't have time to worry about a ghost or whatever she was. So I continued to do nothing about it. It was nearly a whole year later that I actually found myself wondering what was in the box left in my office by the gardener, so I put it on my desk and started looking through. There was a mixture of things from coins to plates and bottles. In fact, there were lots of bottles. They looked like the old medicine bottles you used to get many years ago, and curiously inside each one was a little material doll. I was quite taken with the bottles and thought they would look good inside the bar area for people to look at and enjoy, so I took the 20 or so bottles and put them on a high shelf in the bar. Over the next few weeks my wife told me that she had started seeing this witch in the same place in the bar area. She wasn't solid but had a wispy quality. I had still seen and felt nothing and none of the guests had complained, so again I just continued working and swept the issue under the carpet. Then one evening a lady came into the bar and asked to speak to me and my wife. I was very busy, but when I saw this old lady stood waiting patiently to speak to us, I put my work aside and went to see what she wanted. The old lady sat down steadily and took her time in choosing her words. The first sentence from her lips had my wife in amazement, and from there on we were both sat wide-mouthed listening to what she had to say. She told us very calmly that we had some poppets that needed returning to the earth. This was exactly what my wife had been dreaming about for the last year. How this lady knew was beyond our comprehension. But she continued on that, many years previous, a practicing witch had lived in an old hut that had stood here before the pub was built. She was not evil or malevolent. She was just out of her mind with concern over these poppets. She wanted them to be returned to their rightful place in the earth and left there for good. It turned out that these little dolls inside the bottles were called poppets, and they had each been made to bind 21 demonic entities to the darker planes of existence. Keeping the bottles above ground was a hazard which could undo her good work lest they should be broken. We didn't really know what to make of this tale, but the woman was insistent that she took the bottles and reburied them for us. My wife was willing to believe her and do as she asked, especially if it meant her nightmares would stop. So for the sake of an easy life I let her take the bottles. She carefully put each one into a box and then silently left the room with a smile. We were left with so many questions unanswered, but after that day my wife never saw the witch again or had another nightmare. I was happy with the result, but something kept nagging at my wife. She said that the old lady who spoke with us and took the bottles looked very much like the witch in her nightmares, and she was adamant that it was her in the flesh. I was just glad that the episode had all blown over, and I still don't really know what to think of it, especially the part about demonic entities. But if you ask my wife, her experience was very different to mine, and she says it was those experiences that forced her into believing in the paranormal.
I thought this story was so interesting. I would have loved to have seen the bottles for myself, but they are probably safer off where they are now. I must ask the next time I go there if anyone else saw the old lady who took the bottles that night. It would be interesting to know if the owners were the only ones to see her. Join me next week for more haunting tales of dark shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe so you never miss another episode. Remember to watch the other frightening episodes. From the haunted Colorworks factory, the demonic parlor, the terrifying dungeon and the sinister devil's church, all on YouTube to watch on a dark night. Watch if you dare.